everyone. Just to let you know, we'll be getting started in a few minutes. We will be right back with you. All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Can we get a warm welcome for our authors this evening? My name is Marianne, and I'm the store manager here at City Bookshop. It is so wonderful to see you all here today, both in person and on Zoom. Thank you for joining us. Quick poll, is anyone here for the first time? Oh my gosh, welcome back, everyone. If you are newly joining us on Zoom, thank you for finding us and being here to celebrate this book. And welcome back to all of you here. If you're here tonight, you may also be interested in some of our other upcoming events and book clubs. Next Thursday, we have an event for The Bell in the Fog with Lev A.C. Rosen, which is a historical mystery. You may also be interested in checking out our YouTube channel, where we have an archive of past events, including a Jewish YA fantasy panel. Some very quick housekeeping before we start. If you wouldn't mind just taking a moment to silence your phones if you haven't already, we'll keep free from disruption tonight. If you need a restroom tonight, they're located right upstairs past the register. More importantly, if you need to purchase a book tonight, tonight's books are also located right at the cash register upstairs. We'll have a conversation and Q&A tonight, followed by a signing. If you have a question during the event, you can raise your hand in person during the Q&A or submit a question using Zoom's Q&A feature during the event. And if you are here in person, we'll just be repeating your questions as they come up. Now, we are here to hear about The Pomegranate Gate, a novel I've been excited about for months, which is the first adventure in a new series, the Mirror Realm Cycle, a Spanish Inquisition-era fantasy trilogy inspired by Jewish folklore. I will let our authors tell you more. And joining us tonight are Ariel Kaplan and Leslye Penelope. Ariel Kaplan grew up outside Washington, D.C., and spent most of her childhood reading fairy tales and mythology before settling on a deep love for Jewish folklore. She began studying the history of medieval Spain and the Convivencia while working on a Monroe Scholar project at the College of William and Mary, where she graduated with a degree in history and religious studies. She is the author of several books for younger readers, and The Pomegranate Gate is her first fantasy novel. Leslye Penelope has been writing since she could hold a pen and loves getting lost in the worlds in her head. She's an award-winning author of fantasy and paranormal romance. Equally left and right-brained, she studied filmmaking and computer science at Howard University and sometimes dreams in HTML. She hosts the My Imaginary Friends podcast and lives in Maryland with her husband and furry dependents. Her latest novel is The Monsters We Defy. Please join me once again in welcoming Ariel and Leslye.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks everyone for being here. So I was backstage gushing to Ariel about how amazing this book was, how much I loved it. I don't know if any of you have already read it. I'm hoping that you definitely will, and will convince you if you have not. So the hardcover is gorgeous. There's beautiful illustrations all the way throughout. And honestly, I guess we should talk about the book, but I actually want to talk about the illustrations and the map. And just, did you have any input into that, because the presentation is so gorgeous?
Do we want to talk about the end papers? Do we want to show people the end papers?
Yeah. Like, they're
so that's in color, which I did not know that was going to be in color until recently, but I did have some input in the map. I was given a couple of different layouts, which I got to choose from, and I got to have a little bit of say in it's particularly the inset and this sort of Hamza here. They asked me what I thought. Yeah, I did not know it was going to be in color though, so that was pretty exciting.
Awesome. Yeah. Sometimes as an author, you get your book and there's a surprise in it. And
Yeah, you hope it's a good
fun.
one.
You hope it's a good one. Sometimes it's not. This is a really good surprise. All right. So about the story, do you want to give us the brief overview of just whet our appetites about the beginning of the story?
Okay, I'll give the brief overview. So the Pomegranate Gate takes place in a mythical late 15th century Spain at the time of the expulsion. And our two protagonists are Toba and Naphtali, who decide together with their neighbors and their families, in Toba's case, to leave Sepharad. As they are in the process of leaving, Toba accidentally follows a pair of Mazics, who are immortal magic users, through a mystical gate in a pomegranate grove into their world, where she's in grave danger and has to find her sometimes protectors to help her keep her safe while she's there. Meanwhile, Naphtali is left behind, and together with Toba's grandmother and the old beggar woman who is taken to following him around, is trying to simultaneously rescue Toba and also get out of Spain before his presence there becomes illegal and the Inquisition takes over.
So in terms of the world, the names of the countries and everything, it's not called Spain. Is it a fantasy world? Is it meant to be our world? And where do the names and that idea come
Okay,
come from?
well, Sepharad is sort of the Hebrew version of Spain, the Hebrew word for Spain. I had a long thought process about whether I was going to use the actual names or not. And I eventually decided not, because I wanted to have, in the first place, a little bit more freedom in terms of the timeline, the historical timeline, and in terms of the geography. And also because I wanted it to feel more like a fantasy and less like a historical novel. I did think about that a really long time. I went back and forth about it, but that was why. But a lot of the time, the place names are Hebraicized versions of real world. So the city in that they begin their adventures in is Rimon, which is Hebrew for pomegranate, which is, of course, the analog for Granada, which is also pomegranate.
That's really cool. Yeah, like I love thinking about world building, and I was really intrigued by that because you talk about there's real languages, like Toba can read in Latin and Arabic, and she's translating into real languages, and they mention the Phoenicians and these real people, but the words, I didn't realize that it felt like it was very fantasy. And so the place names were all different, but there are these analogs. So it does give it this really mythic quality of our world, but maybe a different version of our world.
Yeah,
like
that's
version.
very much how it's meant to be. It's sort of like a slightly off-kilter version of our world where things are similar but not precisely the same.
Mm-hmm. That's very cool. So there's also an epigraph at the beginning, and I wanted to ask you about that, how that influenced it, or was it an inspiration on the story, or was it something that came later?
I needed an epigraph, and so I read a lot of Sephardi Hebrew poetry. It was actually, a lot of it was written in Arabic at the time, but a lot of Jewish Spanish poetry it's earlier than this, but of the era when the Jewish poetry was really flourishing in Spain. So there's actually two poems in here. Let me see if I can show people. Because I thought they did a really nice job with the design.
The art here too is amazing. So if you can't see on Zoom, the art, and throughout the book there's art, and it's really nice.
So that's where those came from. And I thought, especially, both of these poems, I've included both because I liked them both so well. I thought really sort of captured the spirit of the novel.
And so why did you choose Spain as opposed to any other country, or why was this the inspiration?
Well, I had been interested in the history of Spain, throughout the entire Middle Ages up until this is really more like early modern, since college. And I feel like it's an underexplored place and time period, particularly in the United States. I think we don't think about it very much. I mean, everybody knows about the Spanish Inquisition, but I think people don't really know so much about the period before it, when you had the three big religions coexisting in Spain at the same time. It was an absolutely fascinating sort of flowering of civilization that happened there. And I think also, it was so key to what came in Europe later in terms of the Renaissance, because so much of the classical learning, the Latin and Greek, that was being translated in Spain by Arab translators. And without that happening, there wouldn't have been the Renaissance. And so that this whole period has always been interesting to me. The history of the Jews in Spain has always been really interesting to me. When I was in college, I was lucky enough to do a semester abroad in Sevilla, and I was able to take some classes in both Islamic and Sephardi Spanish history. So I've been wanting to sort of set something in that time period for a long, long time. And it wasn't until sort of a few years ago that I had this idea of first finally something I could do with it.
Yeah, and I guess classic question, where did the inspiration for this particular book come from? What was the gnawing factor that gave you years of your life to this book?
Oh, that's so hard. I mean, I had the idea, so there's sort of a dual narrative here, and I had the idea for Toba's part of the story years and years ago. And I even started outlining it, and it was not really enough to be a novel. And it wasn't until sort of during the pandemic, really, most of this was written during the pandemic, that I had the idea that, okay, I needed another narrative that would sort of ground it in more the real world. And once I had Naphtali and I had that idea, it started to come together pretty quickly.
And the two stories are really woven together really nicely.
Thank you.
And you do a great job of like forcing the reader to stay up all night to read the thing, because like every scene ends in almost like a cliffhanger, and you just have to keep going. And they're short and they're paced really well. And you care. Sometimes with dual narratives, it can be difficult to get the reader to care equally about both stories. People have a favorite, but at least for me, I cared equally about both, and I was really happy to get back to Naphtali and happy to get back to Toba. And so yeah, that was really nicely done. I guess research. Did you have to do a lot of research? You'd done research in college.
I was lucky. I still had all my books, which is good, because if you read a lot of nonfiction, you know that stuff goes out of print fast, and then you can't find it again. There has been a lot of newer scholarship, obviously, since I was in college. So I did have to do a fair amount of refamiliarizing myself with the time period, and there were different things that I needed to look up, like the history of Jewish piracy, which, yes,
yeah, no,
there are books on that now.
There's books on everything.
Yeah,
and it's like that's another like little detail that's like was really fascinating and shows up at just the right time. No spoilers. But can you talk about the folklore that you based it on? Because I'm not familiar with Jewish folklore, and I don't know how much of it is very common that you're using, or something that you made up, or things that might have been inspirational.
It's a pretty big mix. So when I was a child, my mother gave me a copy of Elijah's Violin and Other Jewish Fairy Tales, which is a compilation of old stories by Howard Schwartz, who was a very famous Jewish folklorist. And I have everything that he's ever put together in my living room. And his stuff is particularly nice because he also includes a lot of after material where he talks about the history of these stories and how they sort of weave together, and how you can see the versions change over time. So you can see a kernel of one story that shows up in many, many different places over the courses of hundreds and hundreds of years. Because it's very diverse. As you have stories, you know, that are coming out of Babylonia, and you have stories that are coming out of Morocco, and you have stories that are coming out of Iran. So I went back, and when I knew I wanted to incorporate a lot of Jewish folklore into this, I had a few ideas for things I wanted to include. I wanted to include the Z's. I wanted to include the City of Luz. And I went back and reread pretty much everything I had to try to see what else I thought would be interesting.
That's interesting, because when I did The Monsters We Defied, it was based on African American folk magic, and so it's less research. There is some research, but it's similar that it's spread out over the diaspora. So like Africans were taken from North America to South America, and the stories, there's threads of similar deities and ideas about this, of the powers and stories and magic and religion and how it all combines, but it's different in different places.
Exactly.
And so
yeah,
the research,
it's similar.
Yeah,
and that you have things evolving also based on, the dominant culture where people were living.
Right. Yeah. Mixing together.
Sure.
And when people had to, like, you have in here the conversos. So it was the Jews that were seen to be converting to Christianity in order to survive.
Yeah.
And it's kind of similar because Black people had to convert, and the enslaved people had to convert to Christianity. Let's be seen to convert to Christianity.
Yeah.
And so then you get a lot of the synchronization of the Christianity, overlaying saints on top of like Orishas, for example, the African deities. And I was wondering about, were there stories passed down in your family that you were able to use that were more personal?
Not in this one. No. Was there anything? There really wasn't in this one, no.
So a little bit more about like the Mazik and the magic system.
Yeah.
So they're magic users. For me, they seemed very fairy-ish and also maybe like jinn-ish.
Yes.
There was a mention of the King Solomon, and I don't know if in Jewish folklore, I know in Arabic folklore, the jinn helped King Solomon build the temple.
Yeah, it's the same.
Okay. So yeah, how did you start working on the magic system and creating that?
If you go and look at the history of demons in Jewish folklore, it can get to be a lot because they aren't always the same. And depending on the time period and who's writing it, and sometimes even in the same culture in the same time period, you have demons who are sort of incorporeal and just sort of like imps, and you have demons who they look like big ugly birds, and you have demons that are more like this. They're more like people, and frequently you find these demons that are like people, and they're not only like people, they're Jews. They have Jewish laws, they have rabbis. And so that was really what I wanted to focus on. But part of it also is that the English word demon is kind of not right here. It's sort of the best that we've got. But it's like if you watch a lot of anime and they're talking about demons, that's not like in the more like Christian sense. They're not bad. It's more like spirits. These are more like the jinn are the same. They're not meant to be. They don't follow human morality, but they're not evil necessarily. So that's where the Maziks came from. In terms of the magic system, the idea of the Mazik world is that it's sort of a mirror of the human world. So what I wanted was to create a magic system which doesn't work the way that Toba in particular thinks that it should, which causes her all kinds of problems without being too spoilery.
Right. Yeah. And there's something interesting about, I guess, identity in terms of Toba specifically, that and were you thinking about themes when you write? Were you thinking about the theme of identity and strength?
That one? Yes. Yeah. To a pretty big extent. Yeah. And her heritage and identity and heritage and legacy, that sort of thing, again, without being too spoilery.
Also, so we have the Mazik magic, but Toba's grandmother Elena has magic, human magic, I guess.
Well,
okay,
yeah,
we won't go there because we'd have to spoil something.
Yeah, well, yes and no, but what she's doing is also she's using magic in the way that makes sense to Toba, which is to say she's using spells. There's mastery involved, and Mazik magic doesn't work like that,
right?
So
it just seemed like there were two different versions or two different ways that it went about. And yeah. So speaking about, so we have Naphtali in sort of the mortal world, and Toba when she's taken through the gate, there's like a found family there where with Naphtali, there's a woman who's only known as the old woman.
Yeah. And
then Elena, who is Toba's grandmother, who's trying to get her granddaughter back. And they don't choose to be together. I don't think any of the three of them really wants to work together, but they stick together. Yeah. And there's a lot of tension there. And I guess thinking about those relationships and like motivations, why these characters are there, how were you thinking about those relationships?
Well, I did want to talk a little bit, it sounds pedantic, but I like about community and the fact that like these three people, particularly Naphtali and the old woman and Elena, they feel like what they owe each other is to help. because they're in this terrible situation. They're all Jews in this terrible situation. And so in that way, they think of each other as like the extended family, even though particularly Elena and the old woman do not like each other at all.
Yeah, it seems like the old woman doesn't really like anyone, even though
she likes Naphtali.
she does.
She does, yeah, even though he makes her nuts, but she likes him.
Yeah. And then Naphtali, who is a tailor's son, very poor tailor. And so I guess it's another thing about identity, trying to figure out if I can't be a tailor, if I'm not a very good one. And there's one point towards the beginning where he's like, he wanted to be the hero. Mm-hmm. And he
wants to be the hero for a lot of the book, and it never goes well for him, but he does try. He tries really hard. So,
and he is a protagonist, so he's like the hero that we're following, even though he's a little bit hapless, but you can't help but like him and feel sorry for him and hope he does better. So this is the first adult book that you have. You've written middle grade before, right?
YA, yeah.
YA. And can you talk about the difference in moving from YA to adult fiction?
Well, it was much longer because it wasn't just YA, it was contemporary YA. So there was a whole big hurdle because this is almost the same length as my first two books put together. Definitely more complex. It was a whole lot of fun to be able to write characters who weren't only teenagers. I really enjoyed that a lot. And I felt like I wasn't quite so tied down to having to write something that sounded like an authentic 17-year-old all the time. So it was nice to be able to write, an 80-year-old woman and sort of explore that a little bit.
And then when you had the idea, was there pushback in terms of your agent or publishers? How was the publishing process of moving between?
Well, this is with a different publisher, or two different publishers, because I have a UK publisher and a US publisher for this. I think my agent was supportive, especially after she read the first 50 or 100 pages I sent her. She said, no, this is good. You should finish it.
And then it is a big book. There's a lot of characters in there. And it starts off with something that you see in fantasy books, not as often maybe as you used to. So you have the dramatis personae, which is like the list of the characters at the front. And then also there's a list of places. And there's also a glossary in the back. And it was very helpful. But I just wondered how you thought about the reader journey, and how do you think about that? Is that something that you really liked in books that you'd read? Just wanting to include that?
The glossary was the idea of my UK editor. She said there's going to be a little bit of confusion, and that way you don't have to explain things in the text, or you don't have to feel like you have to explain things in the text. So I said, that's fine. I don't mind. The place list and the dramatis personae, I actually had one, like I had a working document as I was writing. So it's sort of a polished up version of that, but it's a long book. And there's also a lot of places, and I needed to keep track of which city was where. I had a map also that I kept on my desk so I could keep track of which city was where. So I didn't accidentally have people walking off into the ocean or anything.
Yeah, having a map. I mean, fantasy loves a map.
Oh yeah,
it's gorgeous, as we already talked about. But you have even the character list. Like I keep those too for myself. I haven't put them in the book, but it's like, oh, that's actually a really good idea. And it's, as a reader, it was just nice to kind of flip back and forth and be like, oh, okay, yeah, you mentioned this, and you're trying to look and see if you can figure out who is who, because there is a little bit of a mystery, about certain characters' identities, and so it was really nice to have. And then, so you mentioned that the Mazik they're actually Jewish.
They're sort of Jewish, yeah.
And I was just wondering, just from kind of a world perspective, because you mentioned certain, like, there's religious rituals and there's things that people will be familiar with, but there's also then the magical, fantastical aspect.
Yeah.
And how does that align in your mind in terms of the religious aspects and then the magical aspects and these magical creatures following Jewish laws and things like that?
I'm trying to think how to answer that. The story is always sort of like the heart of it, and so a lot of it has to do with trying to figure out just sort of how all those pieces fit together. And in terms of the Mazik being sort of, they're almost a little bit more like contemporary secularized Jewish people than the humans in this. But also these are the Mazics don't age, and they don't die of natural causes for the most part. So the big question about them is, okay, well, what would they be like, these people, if they were, hundreds or thousands of years old, and how would that manifest in the Mazic world? And what would their politics look like, and how would that influence their practices, and those sorts of questions.
So I think we're ready for questions from the audience. Anyone have any questions here or online?
So I know this is, you're planning to have a series with this.
Yes.
So what's your process like? You kind of know where it's going, or are you going to kind of write each book as it comes?
There is a draft of book 2.
Okay.
So the draft of book 2 is almost completely revised, but not quite. So I didn't have a full outline of the other. So there's going to be 3. I didn't have a full outline of everything going into it, but I had a synopsis of all 3, which is how I sold it. So I had this book and then the synopses of the other 2. I know how it ends, which is important. I know where it's going. So soon there will be a book 3 also, but not yet. Gosh, wow.
One of the things that I really like is it kind of balances, like you have those 2 perspectives, you have the but you also have these kind of characters as well. And I was curious, like, how did you balance those out, or like how did you use that as a tool for storytelling?
I was going to repeat it for the Zoom people. Our question was about balancing the perspectives between not just the 2, but the multiple perspectives.
Well, a lot of the more secondary characters that get point of view scenes, point of view chapters, that came in a little bit later. Like Elena, Topa's grandmother, get some page time, and it needed to be there for the story because she knows things that the main characters don't. And so I think in terms of balancing the secondary characters, if that's sort of the question, I sort of pulled them in because I felt like it was necessary, because it's not being written from an omniscient point of view. There were certain characters who the plot really couldn't continue unless we knew sort of their history and their individual secrets. But also it was fun to write some of those other characters. I think it brought a little more texture.
I know this is maybe you're on your you have a whole trilogy to write, so I understand if maybe the answer is not yet, but I was wondering if there's any other kind of area of Jewish history or folklore that you're interested in exploring in like a future series or a future book.
The question is there another area of Jewish history or folklore that you're interested in exploring?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jewish folklore is so big. There's so much. I think that you could write about it forever and never get to the bottom of it. But yeah, I have other things sort of in the back of my mind for once this is done that I'd like to look into a little bit more. Yeah, thank you.
Who was the most difficult character to write? Who was the easiest, and why?
The most difficult and easiest characters to write, and why?
I'm trying to think of how to answer that in a non-spoilery way. So in terms of who is the easiest to write, the easiest character to write is actually not a point of view character. The easiest character to write for me, I think, was Barzilay, who was one of the Mazics, and he gets a lot of fun dialogue, and any scene with him in it was sort of wrote itself. He was very easy to write. He also has page time with both of the protagonists. So that was pretty easy. In terms of what was more difficult, one of the other secondary point of view characters is the Courser, who is, how to describe her? Like, we haven't talked about her, but she is sort of one of the Mazic antagonists. And it was tricky to write her without giving too much away. So that part was a little bit more challenging.
And yeah, and that character is really great because she is an antagonist, and she does terrible things, but you know enough about her to have at least some empathy or to know how she got there.
Right.
Yeah. And so it's good to.
And she's not exactly sympathetic, but you can
Right.
sort of understand that she didn't put herself in this situation.
Right. And she's kind of just trying to survive.
Yeah.
Okay. We have one more.
So between your YA and adult novels, do you think there are themes that like were found you found yourself exploring in both, or do you think one medium is better for something than another?
Oh, that's really hard.
Are there themes that cross over between the YA and this novel, or is one genre better for one?
Probably, if I sat down and thought about it, there are probably, I noticed in my YA books, there are things I tend to do over and over unconsciously, and I'm sure I'm probably doing it here to an extent too. I'm trying to think of what I can say that I think is probably carries over. I tend to talk about identity a bit. I tend to have characters who are concerned about disappointing their parents, which Naphtali is very concerned about being a disappointment to his father, although he is, for most of the story, not alive. That's not much of a spoiler, but
I think authors do have themes they go back to, and yeah, we're not always conscious of them, but because they kind of come up again and again, like the identity thing you mentioned, you can see it in multiple characters here. And I guess Naphtali and Toba are the youngest characters. They're not teenagers, but they're young 20s, mid 20s, maybe.
Yeah, they're supposed to be. I think Naphtali at one point tells somebody he's closer to 30 than 20. So
Right,
they're
yeah.
late 20s, and Toba she's old enough that it's strange that she's not married.
Right.
And people comment on that.
And I wasn't sure because of medieval times that could be 18. I don't know.
Yeah. I think they say that she's
she
more than 10 years past marriageable age.
Yeah.
So she's getting up there.
And they kind of seem young because they've both been, well, she's been very sheltered.
Yeah, and so is he.
And
yeah.
And so they're
both fairly naive.
Right.
Yeah.
But so that kind of coming of age is still, even though they're a little older, there's still a little bit of coming of age. And with Toba specifically, like her identity issues and her fear, I think, comes into play in interesting ways too. I know that there was a question in the back. Question is about influences and inspiration.
Well, I talked about Howard Schwartz already, but I'll mention him again because the way I felt reading those folk tales as a child is something I really wanted to replicate. It was this specific type of very, very strange magic, which also felt very possible to me, that I really loved. In terms of nonfiction, there was a book that came out a couple of years ago, which blew my mind, called The Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. Which was, that book was wild. And so it wasn't a huge influence, but it sort of pointed toward some aspects of Jewish history that somehow get sort of pushed off the page. In terms of fiction, I mean, Naomi Novik is sort of the obvious answer because when she came out with Spinning Silver, I found it in a bookstore and it was, on a display with a card, index card saying, read this book. And when I read it, it was one of the first big Jewish fantasy books I'd ever read. And it made it feel like, oh, okay, like this is possible now. This is, there's interest in this in a way that I didn't think there was.
I got to do this with Naomi Novik, who is one of my favorite authors. I got to interview her when she came to town last year, and it was just one of the highlights of my author career.
Yeah.
And because I love Uprooted, I love Spinning Silver.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm talking about the latest trilogy, the Golden Enclaves trilogy. But and I hadn't had an experience with Jewish folklore before, or Jewish inspired fantasy, I guess, before that. And they're very different. I mean, there's going to be comparisons because you're pulling from the same well, as there always will be. But the representation matters so much that you're doing something very different, but still very wonderful and very excellent. So it's really cool to be able to talk to you both.
Yes.
So a lot of like I've found with a lot of fiction that focuses on Jewish people is usually not focused on Sephardic Jews. Is there a reason that you chose Sephardic Jews and not Ashkenazi or anything else? And like what your process is to like focusing on something that isn't often focused on?
So the question is the decision to focus on Sephardic Jews instead of Ashkenazi because it's more rare.
Well, I mean, the history, it's again, I think again goes back to my interest in the history of Spain, is that there was that, you know, many 100-year period where it wasn't that they were free of persecution, because they definitely weren't, but it was sort of a flowering of Jewish culture in medieval Europe in a way that didn't really exist elsewhere. And it was, to me, that was really interesting. I don't think this story would have worked in an Ashkenazi context. I don't think, I mean, there were definitely, the Jews were being expelled all over Europe at different times, but I don't think it would have felt the same. It didn't have the same, I think the Spanish Jews, it was much more shocking to be expelled from there than other places where it just happened over and over again. So I think this particular story couldn't have existed outside of Spain.
Any kind of like particular first-hand source or like any kind of source that you fell in love with that was just kind of like jumped out at you during the research that you felt like had a huge influence on the book?
Question is about a source that jumped out at you more than any other.
Well, this is a little bit weird, but I came across in a bookstore ages and ages ago. It was a cookbook. This is going to sound, it's very depressing. It's very depressing. So a lot of, it's totally out of print. I'm sure. I'm sure they didn't print more than, you know, like 500 copies of this, because I don't know how many people wanted it, but it was a lot of what we know about what Spanish Jews were eating is because at the time of the Inquisition, that was the thing that got them arrested. And so like, and there are records of all of this. And so you have, you know, so-and-so was turned in by their neighbors because they were eating eggplant on Fridays. And then, you know, there might've been a fairly significant description of how they were preparing it. So it was a whole list of recipes. It wasn't a list, it was a book of recipes and explanations for how they got these in these Inquisition records. That was, I mean, it was very depressing to read, you know, because then these people would then be tortured and killed and stuff, but and then we know what they were eating. That was fairly influential just because there isn't a whole lot of material on people's day-to-day life. And also just from a world building perspective to know more about how people were living, because it wasn't just the food. It was also, you know, they were caught bathing in a stream on Fridays. They were caught washing their hands, that sort of thing.
For both of you, tell us about what you're reading and enjoying these days.
What are we reading and enjoying these days?
Oh, I'm going blank.
It's a hard question.
Oh, sorry.
Every book always flies out of your head.
Yes. I just started recently the Heaven and Earth grocery store, and I'm kind of had to pause it because I was doing revisions on book 2, but it's very excellent so far.
Yeah, aside from this one, which took over my entire week, I just read Black Candle Women by, I think, Diane Marie Brown is the author's name, which was really great. So it's a contemporary kind of voodoo practitioners, a family of women, and there's a curse that says any man they fall in love with will die. And so the teenage daughter, you know, has this boyfriend and their family freaks out. So yeah, it's really interesting. And then, yeah, like that's probably because I had a book that was due, and sometimes the reading takes a backseat to the deadline. One more. I have time for one more question. Anyone have a final thought? So I have one, if there's nothing coming, just after the trilogy, would you have your eyes? I mean, I know you still have the book 2 to turn in 3. It's a lot.
Yeah.
But sometimes we have our shiny things that distract us or the thing we're looking forward to. Do we have anything in mind afterwards?
I do have another sort of fantasy-ish sort of standalone. I would like to write a standalone after this. I think that would be sort of a nice like a palate cleanser. But I do have something, but it's going to have to be on the back burner, I think, for a bit. So
I understand that. I did a long fantasy series, and then I had to do a series of like 2 standalones in a row, and then a short series, and now I'm finally ready for another long fantasy series. So sometimes taking that break, clearing your head, a couple of books that are just shorter,
yes.
and self-contained.
I keep thinking maybe like a picture book. A picture book would be good.
Yes, like 100 words, 1,000 words, something like that. Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much, Leslye and Ariel, for being here tonight. This was such a wonderful conversation. Some quick notes just to close us out. If you still need a copy of either Ariel or Leslie's books, we have them at the register. They're also available on our website, and we ship anywhere. We are going to transition to signing. We'll just take a moment to kind of clear out this space. We'll ask if you have a moment to just fold up your chair and set it against the wall. We'll bring out a table and reconvene in a few moments. And we are just so grateful to have everyone here tonight. Thank you again.